Welcome back to the Revelation On Demand podcast, a podcast dedicated to bringing you revelation from the Bible. I'm your host, Justin D. Myers, and it looks like we're going to be doing this alone from now on. So, I'm not sure where Chris is. If you hear this, buddy, we're praying for you. Know that you've been in my prayers since we talked over 2 weeks ago. Hope you're safe. Hope you're doing all right. You're always welcome to come back to this podcast, man. I really appreciate what you brought to this. I really appreciate what you've done to get me to the place where I could continue on this podcast by myself. You know, you've given me the confidence that I can keep doing this. Like I said, I haven't heard from him, so I hope he's all right. I pray he's all right. If you guys please pray for Chris. He was in a pretty rough place last I talked to him. So here's hoping that God has a plan for him, that he's safe, and that maybe someday he will rejoin us. But until then, we shall keep a stiff upper lip and continue on. So going from one somber thing to another, there's been a lot of talk about the Roe versus Wade and abortion and all that sort of stuff lately. So I wanted to chime in, I think. Personally, I believe that the act of abortion is murder because I believe a human is conceived when conception happens, not just a clump of cells. And I think most people can understand that once there's a unique DNA sequence there, that it's its own person. So I think abortion is one of those things that we should just avoid as much as possible. I understand that people might have hard times or that there may be places where there's exceptions, but I don't think a rule should be built off of exceptions. So in the case of, pregnancies that threaten the life of the mother, and I mean threaten the life of the mother, not just you're going to have a rough time of it. I mean actually threaten the life of the mother, like ectopic pregnancies or pregnancies with that hemorrhage, that sort of stuff, then medical intervention is necessary. But in the case of hemorrhages, we can usually happens late enough that the baby can get life support too. So when there's, a line of families waiting to adopt babies, I see zero reason to even consider killing all these children. So now, that granted, we do need more people to step up to the foster system because there's been a lot of kids that have just been left in there. But those are kids that mostly, had parents before, but they've gotten sick, they've gotten killed, they've gotten, they become people who are too unreliable. The state took the children away. That's the kind of kids who end up in foster, not the kind of kids who are abandoned at birth. It is easy to get people who want a baby. It's hard to get older kids adopted. And that's a real tragedy. After we're done having our kids, we've talked about looking into helping with the foster care system. And we're getting closer to being done having our children. So we plan to do something like that, I think. Anyhow, continuing on. What we did last episode, we covered Amos chapter 7, right? Amos chapter 7, which he was talking about visions that he was given of locust and fire and the plumb line, and how this was, God gonna, bring judgment down on Israel. And Amos intervened on 2 of those, if you remember correctly, and managed to persuade God not to bring down the judgment. So that was interesting, and we've seen this multiple times in the Bible. I hope to go over more of these places where it looks like that humans have had a way to convince, to persuade God of doing something that is in line with his nature, not out of line with his nature, which is very interesting. So I hope to dig in more on those as we come along to those. And then Amaziah and Amos and Amaziah, the high priest, had a throwdown where Amaziah was pretty much calling Amos a charlatan and that he was just doing this for the money. And Amos came back and cursed him and said, if I was just in it for the money, I'd go back to farming, pretty much. So, not a whole lot I can think of needing to go into this chapter. Again, we're going to see a lot of pretty hard stuff as we go through this, and God talking about humanity in a pretty harsh way. So that's part of the reason why I think Amos is so underread and unappreciated, because it's a pretty hard book to read. So we see places where he's using very coarse language. He's using he's not sugarcoating it in any way. He's not putting it behind euphemisms. He's pretty much saying that, God is upset and that he's going to destroy this land for basically not following God anymore. Which, today can feel like something that's really brutal. But back then, many gods that were believed in were far more brutal than God was at this point. So, we're going to be reading Amos chapter 8 today. If you're looking to follow along with scripture, we'll do the first little section here, and then we'll stop and talk about some points, and then we will finish out the last section. So joining me in Amos chapter 8. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me, a basket of ripe fruit. Wow, fruit. What do you see, Amos? He asked. A basket of ripe fruit, I answered. Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, the songs of the temple will turn to wailing, many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Hear this, you who trample the needy, and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and that the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat? Skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. So, you see right here, it starts off with a vision that Amos is being shown by the Lord. And we see he's showing him a basket of ripe fruit. And I would imagine that it's not necessarily ripe in the way we would think, like, oh, it's perfect to be eaten. It could be. It could also mean ripe as in it's overripe, in which, this fruit is starting to rot and stink. And now the Lord's talking about it's time to get rid of it, or to collect it in that matter. So, in both senses, you could think of it as it being rotting and overripe, and you can see that the Lord's ready to get rid of this, or it's ripe, which we've seen in Revelation, where He harvests the grapes of wrath and then presses it into a wine. So it could be ripe and ready to just be harvested. I would tend to side on the side that's overripe and it's time to get rid of it, because I don't like thinking of evil and terrible people as ripe, in the sense of ripe fruit. So again, we're talking about the end of days. This is not necessarily just talking about those guys there at that time, where, as I've said before, I think there's full fulfillment of prophecy and partial fulfillment of prophecy, which, again, these people at the time in Israel were kind of treating the Sabbath the way most Americans treat the Sabbath today. And kind of one of those, well, it kind of sucks that all these businesses are shut down for one day, and, I really need to do something. Or, nowadays, that really doesn't happen anymore. We don't have a Sunday where you can't almost do anything because there's everything closed. Most of the time, most people are open on the Sabbath. You can get anything you want on the Sabbath, So we've really fallen away from that. And I think this is just him talking about their longing to get to the place where we are today, where Only very few businesses actually still have a Sabbath day where they don't do any work whatsoever. And then he's talking about the songs in the temple turning to wailing and the many bodies flung everywhere. So, this is people going through the motions and singing their songs and doing what they're supposed to. And God is, again, seeing their hearts and seeing that they're not in this and that they're not wanting to do this. So there will be death and wailing to come over the temple. And of course, when dead bodies are in the temple, because unlike today where we bring the dead into our churches for church services and stuff like that, that would have been seen as a very defiling thing. Because if you remember in Deuteronomy, or if you study Deuteronomy, there's a lot of talk about when you touch a dead body or a dead body is near, it kind of defiles the holiness of the area. So we see that God himself was talking about defiling this temple, which, it's just him making a point after these people who say they're following God have already defiled the temple. So we see that he's reiterating their guilt, and he's bringing down punishment. And we see that he even talks about how they've cheated the poor. They sold them less than high quality goods. They're selling more. They're selling more grain than they're giving them. That's the dishonest scales. They're boosting the price. Saying, "Oh, I need to. Prices have gone up. I need this." And then skimping on the measure again, selling more than they're actually giving. And then here's one that's really bad, like selling even the sweepings with the wheat. So what they would do, and we still do this today, but we have machines that do this, is they would separate the hulls, because there's a little thin shell on wheat when it's harvested, and you would get the gleanings, is what it's called. You'd separate them from the wheat, and then after you're done doing this process, and I'm sure they had some technology to help with this, kind of like sieve things. And if not, just throwing it up and letting the wind blow off the little chaff. There would be, you'd want to clean up the threshing floor. You'd want to clean up the area you were pulling this chaff up. So you'd sweep that up. And normally, you just sweep that out the door. Or, if you're really dedicated to using everything, you could sweep it into the garden and let it become mulch, or stuff like that. I don't know. I'm sure they did stuff like this back then, but I'm thinking about it today. Like you could use that for biomass to become mulch and stuff like that. But anyways, these people are literally sweeping that up and then selling it with the wheat. Like they did all this work to separate from the wheat, and now they're sweeping it up and just selling it with the wheat. To kind of add a little bit of weight. Who's going to notice a little bit of dust and wheat shells in their wheat? Honestly, I think I would. And I'd be very upset that I was getting that, But, people put up with a lot more than they should most of the time. So we see God is talking about, they've really had this unfair practices. They've been, very unfair with the poor and the needy. They've just been abusing them, taking advantage of the fact that they really don't have any other options. And then also their irreverence to just want to do business on the day that is set aside as Sabbath. And, they call themselves Jews. Is pretty much what this is. Like, you call yourself a person of the Lord, but you don't take pleasure in the Sabbath. You don't take pleasure in the things of God. All you care about is the things of this world. And we see that still today, we see people still more focus on the things of this world than the things of God. And that can be very, very sad. So continuing on at verse 7, the Lord has sworn by himself, the pride of Jacob, I will never forget anything they have done. Will not the land tremble for this, and all who live in it mourn? The whole land will rise like the Nile. It will be stirred up and then sink like the river of Egypt. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon, and darken the earth in the broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning, and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth, and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for only a son, and the end of it like a bitter day. The days are coming, declares the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from the sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. In that day, the lovely young women and strong young men will faint because of thirst. Those who swear by the sin of Samaria, who say, "As surely as your God lives, Dan," or "As surely as the God of Beersheba lives," they will fall, never to rise again. So we once again see this pride of Jacob, which is talking about the self-sufficient attitude of the Israelites, where they're not relying on God like they should. They're not, thinking and properly asking God to provide for them and to give them what they need and to give them the strength and wisdom to do what they need to do, and the guidance on what they should be doing. They're not doing this. They're all about taking care of their own, taking care of their own things. They're all about being self-sufficient. They're only thankful for their own hard work, pretty much. And they're not thankful for God and his guidance and his blessing. And then we see him talking about flooding and the flooding of the Nile, which, if you don't know anything about the Nile, it floods regularly at certain seasons and pretty predictably. So during the rainy seasons, it comes up and floods the area around it, the Nile Basin, and then it subsides. And I think today we've done a lot to shape where that flood goes in that area. Humans have taken over that area quite well, but I do think there's parts that are left to flood in their natural way so that we don't, I'm assuming the people there don't want to restrict the Nile too much, because I can imagine that much water that we're talking about, whenever you get into flooding scenarios and stuff like that, can be very, very dangerous. So we have that area around the Nile that when it floods, it gets flooded with nutrient-rich soil. Very good, lake, or not lakes, river sand, or river nutrients that come up. And a lot of places around the Nile would count on that for agriculture. They would count on the river to come up and flood their fields in the areas and give them that extra sediment, that extra fertilizer, and then they would plant in that area and harvest crops from there, and it would be very, very rich. But anyways, enough of that. He brings up the flooding, the regularity of the flooding as, the certainty that the next flood's coming, your destruction is coming as well. And of course, he's talking about the day of judgment, where he's talking about how he will remove his presence basically from all the earth, and people will be lost and they won't know what to do, and they won't have the presence of God anymore. And again, this is talking about the very end days, which, it's something I wanted to talk about. Something I noticed is that as long as Christians, or those who walk with God, I should say, are here to intervene and intercede on the behalf of the evildoers in the world and the people who aren't, are in that gray area where they're not quite good people, they're not quite bad people. Sorry about that. If I didn't manage to edit out that bang, it was my son coming to ask me a question. The door is very sticky and makes a loud noise when it opens. Where was I? Yes. He's talking about the day of the Lord, where all these terrible things are going to happen. And, the interceding point. I was talking about how as long as there's people who follow God, who are there to intercede on the behalf of people who aren't following God, I believe that this world will continue to go on, basically. So as long as there's, I wouldn't want to say just one single Christian, because at that point I think God would be like, all right, buddy, this isn't going anywhere. Let's go and get this show on the road. But as long as there's a group of Christians who are in the world, around the world, interceding and praying for the world, I think that's going to continue. The world's going to continue. I just don't see any reason why it wouldn't. And that was kind of a revelation for me today. So that, or not today, it was yesterday when I had this. But as long as us Christians are here praying for and interceding on the behalf of the people who deserve, destruction, I believe this world will continue and the end of days will be put off longer and longer. Because I believe there is going to come a point, as it says in the book of Revelation, where there will be almost no believers left. And at that point, that's when the day of the Lord's begins. That's when destruction begins. So when I hear about these revivals and these swellings in the ranks of Christians and these people coming back to faith and all that stuff, it's wonderful. I'm excited for that because I think it means it pushes off the day of destruction. It's just something I kind of thought about yesterday. And I think that can give us some peace. Now, it doesn't mean we should grow complacent, because as we've seen with Amos talking to Israel about complacency, that's one of the most deadly things to do. If we grow complacent, we grow lazy, we grow selfish, we don't do the things we're supposed to do. So let's be grateful, but let's not be complacent. So here at the end, he starts talking about how they haven't listened to God, and they've been following other gods. So God is withdrawing his revelation, because if they're content to ignore God, then God's content not to lead them or give them revelation anymore. So we see this as kind of God, shaking off the sand, the dirt, the dust, and continuing on with this plan, not letting the Israelites' lack of faith in dedication to God be the downfall of God's plan. And then we hear this place here, the guilt of Samaria, or the sin of Samaria. This could be a wordplay in Hebrew, which is a word that means sin or guilt. And it sounds very similar to the Canaanite word for their goddess Asherah. So this could be a play on words, talking about the guilt of the guilt of, I gotta find the sin of Samaria, or the guilt of Samaria, the Asherah of Samaria. So he's very much talking about how they have added worship of this lesser deity, or this idea of self-sufficient self-madeness, this idea of, you are what you make of yourself, sort of thing, instead of you are what God's made you. We see that a lot today, especially in America, where, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and become whatever you want to become just by sheer will and in dedication. And we see this very self-made, very self-centered kind of attitude that is not exactly what God calls us to do. Like, he doesn't want us to be pushovers. He doesn't want us just to crawl in the ball and give up and die. But he also wants us to properly worship him, for everything that's good in this world is because of him. So some translations do point this out as idol or goddess of Samaria. So the one we read, which I think is still the NIV, pulls it out as sin of Samaria, which as the spiritual podcast, I think it would hit differently if it's not sin, instead the goddess of Samaria. That brings up different things. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to dig into why certain publishers have decided to use sin instead of talking about the goddess. But that's what we see there. It's talking about just not following God as they should. And then it says right here, as surely as your God lives, Dan, or as surely as the God of Beersheba lives, they will fall, never to rise again. I think this is kind of tongue-in-cheek. So these people he's talking to really believe in these other goddesses and gods. Beersheba and Asherah, and stuff like that. And it's all lowercase, at least in my translation. So he's not talking about the God. He's talking about these lesser gods, these gods of... there's two different types of gods. There's the gods that have craved worship and, want to be worshipped, and that have led man astray to worship them instead of God. And then there's the gods who are just these, as we've talked before, the gods are these beings, much like angels, more than likely, that were created by God to basically run everything in the world, to be all the forces of nature and all that sort of stuff. So we have the gods that want to be worshipped, and it's the ones that fell with Satan and that actively lead people astray. And then you have the gods that are just these natural forces that humans decide that they're going to worship because we are very superstitious people. So you have two different kinds of gods there, and both are not the kinds of gods that need to be worshipped. Both are not the kind of gods that we are called to acknowledge as almighty beings. There's only one of those, and that is our God, Yahweh. He's the only God that is worthy of praise and all this sort of stuff. And so this is very tongue-in-cheek, Amos is saying this to the tribe of Dan, with the people in Israel, and saying, as sure as your God lives, they will fall, never to rise again. Pretty much saying your gods are powerless against the one mighty God, and he's very much tongue-in-cheek, because these people believe these gods exist, or believe that they are all-powerful gods that they should be worshiping. So that pretty much sums it up for today. What can we take away today? We can get caught up in making our own idols very easily. We can get caught up in being very self-sufficient, and we really need to remind ourselves in these times when we feel like it's all about us, all about I did this and I did that and I accomplished this and it was with the sweat off my back and all that sort of stuff. Whenever we start thinking like that, I think it's a kind of a red flag for us to take a moment and stop and say, you know what? No, that wasn't me. That was God. That was everything that I've done in my life that I'm proud of. That was God. That's kind of where we need to be. And we need to thank Jesus for bringing that revelation to us, that since he died on the cross, since he made that possible for our good actions in this world to actually have an impact on the afterworld, like he had to come, he had to sacrifice his perfect life for our imperfect life. And through that, any good that we do, any good that we accomplish is actually accrued. It actually helps in the future. It actually doesn't just imprint on this world, it imprints on the next. And any good that we accomplish, any feats that we get done, any day-to-day thing that is a success in the way of getting our lives together and taking care of the people we love and those around us who need help, any of those directly related to God. And we need to just take a minute and remind ourselves everything good comes from God. And we need to be grateful for that. Thank you for listening to the Revelation On Demand podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you catch podcasts from. Please, if you like what we're doing, share this with a friend, family member, or someone from your church. This is a completely private venture, and we receive no funding from any sources. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please feel free to contact me at revelationondemand@gmail.com, and you will find that in the description. God bless, and see you next time.